The last time we heard from investigators yesterday evening, they told us that they are following up on every lead and asking for help from the public to help bring this little girl home safely.
On a quiet February afternoon, Faye was exactly where she was supposed to be playing, just a few steps from her front door. Her mother could see her. The neighborhood felt safe. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, within minutes, she was gone. What happened next would unravel a truth so close to home, it would leave an entire community questioning how they ever felt safe at all. Faye Marie Swetlick was 6 years old. She lived in Casey, South Carolina, a small, tightly knit community where neighbors waved to each other, where children played outside, and where life moved at a pace that felt predictable. Safe, even. Faye wasn't just another child in that neighborhood. She was the kind of kid people remembered. Her mother, Selena, often described her as her little magical fairy. And it wasn't just a nickname. It was how Faye moved through the world. She had this instinctive kindness, the kind that couldn't be taught. She would stop strangers just to compliment them. Their hair, their shoes, anything. She wanted people to feel seen. At just 6 years old, Faye had already figured out something many adults never do, that small moments of kindness could change someone's day. She was energetic, bright, and deeply social. The kind of child who didn't stay quiet for long. She laughed easily, talked often, made friends quickly, and when she stepped onto the school bus each morning, she carried that same warmth with her. Faye was a first grader at Springdale Elementary School. Her days were simple school, home, play, but within that simplicity, there was a world of imagination. She loved being outside, loved movement, loved the feeling of freedom that came with just being a kid. There was no indication, not even the smallest hint, that anything in her life was about to change. February 10th, 2020, started like any other day. That afternoon, just before 3 p.m., Faye stepped off her school bus. Her mother was there waiting, as always. They walked home together, side by side, talking. It was routine, the kind of moment that happens so often. You don't even think about it. When they got home, Faye had a snack. Then she went outside to play. It was normal. Completely normal. Selena stayed inside, but checked on her frequently, glancing out the window every few minutes, like any parent would. Faye was right there, in the front yard, within view, safe. At some point between 3:30 and 4 p.m., a neighbor saw her near a fence line close to a local business nearby. She was just running around, playing. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Just a child enjoying her afternoon. Then, around 3:45 p.m., everything changed. Selena went to check on her again, and Faye wasn't there. At first, it didn't seem real. Maybe she had walked around the corner. Maybe she had gone to a neighbor's house. Maybe she was hiding playing a game. But minutes passed. Then more minutes. Selena started calling her name. No answer. The kind of panic that follows in moments like that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds, slowly, quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. She searched the yard, then the street, then nearby houses. Nothing. Faye hadn't wandered far. She hadn't been seen leaving. She had simply vanished. By the time Selena called 911, her voice reflected something deeper than fear. It was confusion, urgency, the realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else. Within minutes, police were on scene, and within hours, the situation escalated beyond what anyone in that neighborhood had ever experienced. Search teams flooded the area. K-9 units began tracking. Helicopters circled overhead. Officers went door to door, asking for surveillance footage. What had started as a missing child case quickly became something much larger, something heavier, because as the hours passed, one thing became increasingly clear. There were no obvious answers. No witnesses who saw her leave. No signs of a struggle. No clear direction. Just a 6-year-old girl who had been playing in her own front yard and was suddenly gone. The community responded immediately. People wanted to help. They showed up in large numbers, ready to search, ready to do anything. But law enforcement had to control the scene. They needed order, structure, precision, because time mattered. Every minute that passed without answers made the situation more urgent. Investigators began collecting footage from home security systems, ring cameras, doorbell cams, anything that might have captured even the smallest detail. They interviewed neighbors. They spoke with family members. They retraced Faye's last known movements again and again. Still nothing. By the evening, the FBI had joined the investigation. That alone signaled the seriousness of the situation. This was no longer just a local missing persons case. It was something far more complex. And yet, outwardly, the neighborhood looked the same. Quiet streets, closed doors, people watching from windows. Somewhere in that same area, within walking distance, the truth already existed. But no one could see it yet. As the night went on, search efforts intensified. Lights scanned through yards and wooded areas nearby. Officers moved methodically, grid by grid, ensuring nothing was missed. But the darkness made everything harder. And the uncertainty heavier. By the next morning, the case had drawn national attention. Hundreds of tips came in. Investigators followed every lead. Every possibility was explored, from the idea that Faye had wandered off to something far more serious. But behind the scenes, many investigators were beginning to shift their thinking, because children don't just disappear like that. Not without a trace. Not without someone knowing something. And somewhere, someone did. What no one realized yet was just how close the answers were. How close the truth had been from the very beginning. And how, hidden within the same neighborhood where Faye had been playing, a quiet, unnoticed presence had already begun to draw the investigation in a direction no one was prepared for. Because while the community searched, and while investigators chased leads, a timeline was already forming. One that would soon reveal that this wasn't random. It wasn't distant. It wasn't unknown. The person responsible was closer than anyone could have imagined. If you walked past Cody that week, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. No raised voice. No visible panic. No sign that anything was wrong. And that's what made it so unsettling. Because while an entire neighborhood searched for a missing child, he was already moving through his routine as if nothing had happened. Cody Scott Taylor was 30 years old. He lived in the same neighborhood as Faye Church Hill Heights in Casey, South Carolina. Not across town, not miles away, just a short distance from where she had last been seen. According to investigators, his home was approximately 150 feet from Faye's, close enough to hear the search efforts, close enough to see police activity, close enough to know exactly what was happening. And yet, nothing about him initially stood out. There was no significant criminal history, no record of violent offenses, no immediate red flags that would have placed him on law enforcement's radar before this case. People who knew him described him as quiet, withdrawn, emotionally distant. He kept to himself not in a way that raised alarms, but in a way that made him easy to overlook. He wasn't deeply connected to the community. He didn't stand out socially. He existed on the edges of conversations, not in the center of them. That kind of personality can be difficult to read, because silence doesn't tell you what someone is thinking. It only tells you that they aren't sharing it. Taylor had studied mathematics at the University of South Carolina, but did not complete his degree. Reports indicate he left sometime around 2009. After that, his life appeared unstable in small, quiet ways. He moved between jobs. He didn't establish long-term roots. At the time of the investigation, he was working at a local restaurant alongside one of his roommates. Nothing about his employment stood out. It was ordinary, routine. On the surface, his life looked unremarkable. But unremarkable doesn't mean understood, because what investigators later focused on wasn't just who he was publicly, it was how he behaved privately, especially in the days surrounding Faye's disappearance. On February 12th, 2 days after Faye vanished, police conducted a routine canvass of the neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They spoke with residents. They searched properties. Taylor's residence was one of them. At the time, he wasn't home. Officers spoke with his roommate and conducted a brief search of the apartment. Nothing immediately tied him to the case. No evidence. No direct link. But there were details, small ones, that would later take on meaning. Inside the apartment, officers noticed a large bag of dirty laundry. It belonged to Taylor. They collected a DNA sample from it. On a nearby table, there was a missing person flyer for Faye. At that moment, it meant nothing. The entire neighborhood had those flyers. People were sharing them, posting them, trying to help. But context changes everything, because what seemed ordinary at first would later be re-examined through a different lens. Later that same day, Taylor returned home from work, and according to his roommate, something felt off. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would immediately trigger alarm, but enough to notice. He seemed tense, guarded, less communicative than usual. And there was something else. A smell in the apartment. At first, the roommate assumed it was air freshener, maybe an attempt to cover another odor, like marijuana. But that explanation didn't sit right, because, according to the roommate, Taylor had never used air freshener before. Not once. It was a small detail, easy to dismiss. But in hindsight, it became something else entirely, a moment where normal behavior shifted, just slightly. And those slight shifts often matter more than obvious ones. That evening, law enforcement returned to speak with Taylor directly. The interaction was brief. When asked about his whereabouts during the previous days, Taylor told officers he had been home, sleeping, alone. No witnesses, no details, just a simple answer. At that point, investigators had no evidence to challenge it. No timeline. No contradiction. So they documented the statement and moved on. But while that conversation was happening, something else had already been recorded. Something far more precise than memory. Surveillance footage. Earlier that same morning, around 1 a.m., a camera positioned near a wooded area behind the neighborhood captured a figure moving through the darkness. The footage showed a beam of light, low to the ground, moving slowly, deliberately. Whoever was holding it wasn't wandering. They were searching, or placing, or doing something with intention. Later, investigators confirmed that the person in that footage was Taylor. He had been in those woods in the middle of the night, alone, at a time when the entire neighborhood was asleep. That alone raised questions. But it didn't stop there. Approximately 6 hours later, surveillance captured him again. This time, walking toward a Walmart on Augusta Road. In daylight, in plain view. He entered the store and went to the gardening section, and stayed there for nearly 20 minutes. Not shopping normally, not browsing casually, just lingering. According to an employee, he appeared uncertain. He told them he was working on a garden, but didn't know what he needed. That statement, in isolation, meant nothing. But according to his roommate, Taylor had never shown any interest in gardening. Not once. Eventually, he selected a few items: seed packets, bags of soil, fertilizer, random, almost disconnected choices. He paid for them and left. Outside, he requested a ride back toward his neighborhood. The driver later described him as quiet, distant, not particularly engaged in conversation. At one point, the driver mentioned the missing child, Faye. Taylor responded that he didn't know anything about it, that he had never seen her, never heard of her. A statement that, again, meant nothing at the time, but would later become part of a much larger picture. At 7:47 a.m., that same surveillance camera near the wooded area recorded him again. This time, he was carrying one of the bags from Walmart. He walked into the woods, disappearing briefly from view. Roughly 60 seconds passed. Then he came back out, without the bag. That moment would become critical, because within hours, investigators would begin searching that exact area, and what they would find would shift the entire case. Because while Cody Scott Taylor moved through his morning, buying supplies, returning home, answering questions, investigators were about to uncover something that would connect everything. A single discovery. Small, easy to miss, but once found, impossible to ignore. And from that moment forward, the search for a missing child would become something else entirely. Everything investigators needed to understand what happened was already there. They just hadn't seen it yet. Because while the search for Faye was still active, while helicopters circled overhead and officers knocked on doors, the truth was sitting quietly inside the same neighborhood, hidden in places no one had looked closely enough. February 10th, 2020. The day had started like any other. Faye came home from school. She had a snack. She went outside to play. Sometime between 3:30 and 3:45 p.m., she was last seen in her front yard. And then she disappeared. From that moment forward, the timeline becomes less about what people saw and more about what no one noticed. Because according to investigators, everything that followed happened quickly, within hours. Not days, not weeks, hours. What happened to Faye in that short window has never been publicly detailed in full. Authorities have been careful, deliberately limiting what they release. Out of respect, out of sensitivity, and because some details are simply too difficult to make public. But what is known comes from the timeline built through evidence. And that timeline begins in the space between when she was last seen and when the search began. Investigators later determined that Faye died on the same day she disappeared, February 10th. That single fact changed everything, because it meant that while the community was searching for her, while volunteers were organizing, while officers were expanding their efforts, Faye was already gone, and the person responsible had already returned to normal life. The next 2 days were filled with uncertainty. Law enforcement worked around the clock. More than 250 officers, FBI agents, and volunteers were involved. The neighborhood was locked down. Every entrance and exit was monitored. Vehicles were stopped and checked. Hundreds of tips came in. Each one followed, each one exhausted. But none led directly to Faye. Not yet. February 13th. 3 days after Faye disappeared. That morning began with urgency, not because of a new lead, but because of something routine. Trash collection day. Investigators knew that if any evidence had been discarded in the neighborhood, it could be gone within hours, forever. So they moved quickly. Teams were assigned to search trash bins throughout the Churchill Heights area. Systematically, one by one. No assumptions. No shortcuts. Every container mattered. And then, at a residence on Piccadilly Square, they found something. A small child's rain boot, polka-dotted, matching exactly what Faye had been wearing the day she disappeared. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't similar. It was a match. Right there, inside a trash container. And next to it, another item. Authorities have never publicly detailed what that second item was. But according to official statements, it was significant enough to immediately shift the direction of the investigation. Within minutes, everything changed. This was no longer a search. It was a recovery. Less than 30 minutes after that discovery, investigators moved toward a wooded area nearby. The same wooded area that had already been searched. The same area that surveillance cameras had quietly recorded movement in days earlier. Less than 200 feet from Faye's home. That's where they found her. Hidden, concealed, in a place so close that search teams had unknowingly passed near it before. The distance matters, because it tells you something critical about this case. This wasn't someone passing through. This wasn't random. This was someone who knew the area. Someone comfortable moving within it. Someone who understood just how close they could stay without being noticed. At that moment, the entire investigation shifted. What had been a missing child case became a homicide investigation. Officially, publicly, irreversibly. But even as that discovery was being processed, something else happened. Another call came in, just a few houses away, at a home on the same street, Piccadilly Square. Officers responded, and there, in the backyard of that residence, they found a man, deceased. That man was later identified as Cody Scott Taylor. At that moment, the two scenes, Faye's discovery in the woods and the man found nearby, had not yet been officially connected. But investigators already understood what they were looking at. The proximity, the timeline, the evidence. It was aligning. Quickly, as forensic teams began their work, the pieces came together. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, items recovered near the residence, each element reinforcing the same conclusion. According to law enforcement, all available evidence pointed to Taylor acting alone. There was no indication of anyone else being involved. No accomplice, no wider network, just one person, one decision, one act that changed everything. The surveillance footage became one of the most critical components of the case because it didn't rely on memory. It didn't rely on interpretation. It showed behavior, clear, sequential, unavoidable. Early in the morning, on February 13th, around 1 a.m., Taylor had been captured moving through the wooded area, a light in his hand, low to the ground, slow, deliberate. Hours later, he went to Walmart, purchased items that, on their own, meant nothing, but in context, meant everything. Then returned, entered the woods again, carrying one of those items, and left without it. That sequence, simple on the surface, became one of the clearest indicators of intent, because it showed preparation, movement, return, and disposal. The Lyft driver's account added another layer, a small moment in time, a casual conversation, but one that placed Taylor in a specific mental space. He had been aware of the search, aware of the missing child, and had denied any knowledge. That detail alone doesn't prove guilt, but combined with everything else, it became part of a pattern that investigators could not ignore. As news broke that Faye had been found, the community shifted from hope to grief. Instantly. There was no transition, no gradual realization. Just a sudden, overwhelming truth. She wasn't coming home. The search was over. And the outcome was exactly what everyone had feared, but tried not to say out loud. Flowers began to appear outside her home. Candles were lit. Messages were left. People who had never met her felt the weight of it. Because cases like this don't stay local. They spread. They reach people. They settle somewhere deeper than just information. They become something emotional, something human. Investigators continued working the case long after that day, processing evidence, reviewing timelines, confirming details. But the central conclusion did not change. All evidence pointed to one person, and that person was already gone. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no trial, no courtroom answers. And that absence created something else entirely. Silence. A silence that left behind one of the most difficult questions in cases like this. Why? Because even with the evidence, even with the timeline, even with a clear conclusion, one thing remained missing. A motive. And in the absence of answers, the case didn't end. It lingered. In the minds of investigators, in the hearts of the community, and in the quiet realization that sometimes the truth is clear, but the reason behind it never is. By the time investigators stood in front of cameras on February 13th, the case had already reached its conclusion. Not in a courtroom, not through an arrest, but through evidence. And that distinction mattered because it meant that everything the public would come to understand about this case would come from reconstruction, not confession. When Faye Marie Swetlick was found in the wooded area near her home, investigators immediately shifted into full forensic mode. The search was no longer about, where is she? It became what happened to her and who did it. The location itself told part of the story. Less than 200 feet from her home. That distance changed the nature of the crime. It eliminated randomness. It suggested familiarity. It pointed towards someone who understood the layout of the neighborhood. Someone who knew exactly how far they needed to go, and no further. At the same time, officers were processing the second scene, the residence, on Piccadilly Square, where Cody Scott Taylor had been found. His death was ruled a suicide, according to law enforcement. That single fact altered the entire trajectory of the case. Because with Taylor gone, investigators lost their only direct source of answers. There would be no interrogation, no confession, no opportunity to ask the most important question. Why? Instead, the case would be built entirely on evidence. And piece by piece, that evidence began to form a clear and consistent picture. Forensic evidence. Investigators collected items from multiple locations. Taylor's residence, the wooded area, trash containers in the neighborhood, clothing and personal belongings. DNA analysis became one of the most critical components. According to officials, Taylor's DNA was linked to items connected to the case. While specific forensic details were not fully released to the public, law enforcement stated clearly that the evidence established a direct connection between Taylor and what had been recovered. This wasn't circumstantial. It wasn't speculative. It was physical. And it aligned with the timeline captured on surveillance footage. The timeline that sealed the case. In many investigations, timelines are built from witness statements. In this case, the timeline came from cameras. Objective, unbiased, precise. Investigators mapped Taylor's movements across a 2-4-hour period. To 1A, Meaniers Feb 13. Seen in wooded area with a light. Morning. Walks to Walmart on Augusta Road. Inside Walmart. Spends to 20 minutes in gardening section. Purchases. Soil, fertilizer, seeds. After leaving. Takes a lift back toward neighborhood. 7:47 a.m. Returns to wooded area carrying a bag. To 1 minute later. Exits without the bag. Each step, on its own, could be explained, but together they formed a pattern. Movement, return, disposal. And when investigators later searched that same area they found Faye, that connection was critical because it didn't rely on interpretation. It relied on sequence. While physical evidence built the foundation, witness statements added context. Taylor's roommate provided key observations. His behavior changed after February 12. He appeared tense and withdrawn. There was an unusual smell in the apartment. He used air freshener, something he had never done before. These details might seem small, but in investigations like this, small deviations from normal behavior often carry weight because they indicate awareness, reaction, an attempt, however subtle, to adjust to something that has already happened. The Lyft driver's statement also became part of the record. During the ride, the driver mentioned the missing child. Taylor responded that he didn't know anything about it. Again, not unusual on its own, but placed within the timeline, it became another point of reference. Another moment where he had the opportunity to reveal something and didn't. When officials addressed the public, their message was direct. All available evidence pointed to one conclusion. Cody Scott Taylor acted alone. There was no indication of a second suspect, a coordinated effort, any outside involvement. This was not part of a larger pattern, not a network, not an ongoing threat. It was a single individual, a single act. And that distinction mattered for public safety, but it did little to ease the emotional weight of the case. In most homicide cases, justice unfolds in a courtroom. Evidence is presented. Arguments are made. A verdict is reached. But in this case, none of that happened. Because Taylor's death meant the legal process could not move forward. There would be no charges filed, no defense, no prosecution, no jury. And that absence left something unresolved. Not in terms of who that question had been answered, but in terms of closure. Because trials do more than determine guilt. They provide structure. They allow families to hear the evidence laid out step by step. They create a space where questions are asked and sometimes answered. Without that process, everything remains incomplete. During the investigation, law enforcement examined everyone connected to Faye's life. Her mother, Selena Swetlick. Her father, Chad Swetlick. Neighbors. Individuals seen in surveillance footage. 2 vehicles spotted leaving the neighborhood early on were investigated. Both drivers were identified and cleared. Phone records were analyzed. Homes were searched. Alibis were verified. Each potential lead was systematically eliminated. And as those possibilities narrowed, the focus returned to Taylor. By the time the investigation concluded, nearly every question had an answer. Who was responsible? Identified. How did it happen? Reconstructed through evidence. When did it happen? Determined through forensic analysis. Where did it happen? Established. But one question remained unanswered. Why? Investigators examined Taylor's background, his digital activity, his personal history. They searched for message, notice, online behavior, any indication of intent or planning. Nothing provided a clear motive. No explanation, no reasoning, just silence. And that silence became one of the most difficult parts of the case, because without motive, the crime exists in a space that feels harder to process, harder to understand, harder to accept. The case remained open for review for nearly a year. Agencies involved included local law enforcement in Casey, the FBI, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Each continued to examine the evidence, ensuring that no detail had been overlooked. Eventually, the conclusion remained unchanged. The case was considered closed as it could be given the circumstances, because even after the investigation ended, even after the evidence was reviewed, even after the case was officially closed, the impact didn't disappear. It stayed in the neighborhood, in the families, in the lives that had been permanently altered, and in the memory of a little girl who had walked off a school bus one afternoon and never made it back inside. In the days after Faye was found, the searchlights disappeared. The helicopters were gone. The police presence faded. The news vans packed up and left the neighborhood. But the silence they left behind was louder than anything that came before it. For the community of Casey, nothing felt the same. This was a place where children played outside, where neighbors trusted each other, where the idea of something like this happening so close, so suddenly, had never truly been considered. And now, it couldn't be ignored. Parents who once felt comfortable letting their children play in their front yards began watching more closely. Doors stayed locked longer. Eyes lingered a little more on unfamiliar faces, not out of paranoia, but out of a quiet, permanent shift in awareness. Because when something like this happens, it doesn't just take a life. It changes how people see the world around them. At the center of that grief was one family. Selena Swetlik had lost her daughter. Not just a child, but a presence. A voice in the house. A laugh in the background. A small, constant energy that filled space in ways only children can. There is no roadmap for that kind of loss. No way to prepare for it. And yet, in the days that followed, Selena did something that many people found both heartbreaking and remarkable. She chose to speak about Faye, not just in terms of what had happened to her, but in terms of who she was. She described her as kind, as joyful, as someone who wanted other people to feel good about themselves. Those weren't abstract ideas. They were habits. Faye would compliment strangers. She would notice small things. She would go out of her way instinctively to make someone smile. That was her nature. And Selena made a conscious decision. If people were going to remember her daughter, they wouldn't remember her as a headline. They would remember her as a person. In the weeks that followed, the community came together in visible, tangible ways. Flowers covered the area near Faye's home. Candles were lit. Handwritten notes were left from neighbors, from strangers, from people who had never met her but felt connected to her story. Because cases involving children carry a different kind of weight. They bypass logic. They go straight to something emotional, something protective, something human. A public memorial was held on February 21st, 2020. Hundreds of people attended. Friends, teachers, first responders, neighbors, strangers. The dress code was simple, pink and purple, Faye's favorite colors, and people honored it. The crowd became a sea of those colors, not coordinated, not organized, but unified. Each person showing up in their own way to say the same thing. She mattered. One of the most emotional moments of that day came not from a speech, but from a gesture. A pink tow truck. It carried Faye's bicycle. Something small, something ordinary, but something deeply symbolic, because it represented the life she had lived, not the way it ended. A child who rode her bike, who played outside, who laughed, who was 6 years old. Inside the memorial, journals were placed out for attendees. People were invited to write messages. Some wrote letters, some drew pictures, some simply wrote her name. Page after page filled with words that were never meant to be read aloud, but were too important not to be written. At the heart of it all was a message from Selena. She didn't focus on anger. She didn't focus on fear. She focused on something else. She asked people to carry Faye forward, not just in memory, but in behavior. To be kinder, to notice people, to give compliments freely, to choose warmth, even in small moments, because that's what Faye did, every day, without thinking about it. In a world that often moves quickly past tragedy, that message stayed, because it offered something rare, a way to respond, not just emotionally, but intentionally. At Springdale Elementary School, where Faye had been a student, a buddy bench was installed on the playground. The concept is simple. If a child feels alone, they sit on the bench, and it signals to others that they might need a friend. It's a small idea, but a powerful one, because it creates awareness, connection, kindness, and in many ways, it reflects exactly who Faye was. A child who didn't need a signal to know when someone needed a friend. She just knew. There were no major legislative changes tied directly to this case. No sweeping policy reforms. But that doesn't mean there was no impact. Because not all change happens through law. Some of it happens quietly. In behavior, in awareness, in the way people move through their daily lives. For law enforcement, the case left a lasting impression. Byron Snellgrove, who led the response, later spoke about the emotional weight of those days. The search, the discovery, the moment everything changed. He described it as something that stays with you, not because of the details, but because of the person at the center of it. A child, a life that should have continued. Even after the case was officially closed, the absence of a motive remained. Investigators had done everything they could. They examined digital records, personal history, behavioral patterns, but nothing provided a clear explanation. No note, no message, no reasoning, just silence. And that silence forces a difficult reality. Not every case provides answers that feel complete. Sometimes the facts are clear, but the meaning behind them is not. And in those cases, people are left to process something that doesn't fit neatly into understanding. But even in that uncertainty, something else remains. Memory, not of what happened, but of who Faye was. A 6-year-old girl who complimented strangers, who played outside, who made people feel noticed, who brought light into ordinary moments without even trying. In the end, cases like this are often remembered for the tragedy, the timeline, the investigation. But the truth is, that's not what matters most. What matters is the life that existed before all of that. The small moments, the personality, the humanity. Because Faye was never meant to be a case. She was meant to grow up, to go back to school the next day, to keep being exactly who she was. And maybe that's the most important thing to hold on to. Not just what was lost, but what was there. A little girl who made the world feel kinder, even in small, fleeting ways. A presence that changed people. A memory that didn't fade when the headlines did. And a name that deserves to be remembered. Not for how her story ended, but for how she lived. Faye Marie Switlick,